While there were many losers in the six-county settlement that emerged to become Northern Ireland, one of the less heard voices is that of three-county Protestants. While Southern Unionists in Connacht, Munster and Leinster were all aware that there was little hope of them staying within the UK once an independent Ireland became a reality, three-county loyalists had tied their political hopes to Ulster Unionism. They had bought wholeheartedly into the new community that had been established, and therefore, when delegates to the Ulster Unionist Council accepted the principle of six-county partition, they felt all the more betrayed by it. As a quick note of terminology in this lecture, loyalist will be generally the preferred term in this article, with Unionists used more often to refer to politically organised loyalism, and Protestant used to refer to the demographic unit and cultural community. As we're going to see, however, the terms were used interchangeably at the time, and while there may have been Protestant nationalists and even Catholic Unionists, they were very rare. The loyalists of counties Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal considered themselves Ulstermen, just the same as could be found anywhere else in the province. They had enthusiastically signed the Ulster Covenant in 1912 and were equally eligible to join the Ulster Volunteers and other Unionist organisations. Mere months before the final partition of Ireland, the Northern Standard was boisterously reassuring its readers that any future settlement would inevitably fall along 9-county lines. However, as the future political settlement would suggest, this commitment to the Ulster Unionist cause was not uncontested. Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal were noticeably different from the other Ulster counties. The 1911 census revealed 4 distinct tiers of Protestantness in Ulster, with the most Protestant being Antrim, Belfast and Down, then the narrow Protestant majorities of Armagh and Londonderry, followed by the narrow minorities of Fermanagh and Tyrone, with Londonderry Borough also being included there, and then finally Monaghan, Donegal and Cavan, with 25, 21 and 18% respectively, were strikingly less Protestant than other Ulster areas. Protestant population was found in 3 significant clusters in the county. In the north, a cluster focused on Coote Hill, although the real locus of Protestant population was Drum and Monaghan just over the border. A second population centre was based around Castle Saunderson on the Fermanagh border, and a final population centre sat near the Leitrim border between Arva and Killashandra. More generally, the north and east of the county were more strongly Protestant. However, only 6 electoral divisions of 93, that you can see on screen there, had Protestant majorities: Springfield, Ashfield, Diamond, Castle Saunderson, Bilberry and Killikeen. Across the county, however, there were numerous smaller townlands that were almost entirely Protestant as the community sought to live near one another. Now, the position of Cavan and Monaghan in historic Ulster is not contestable. However, the position of the two in a cultural Ulster zone, and therefore the placing of its loyalist community under the aegis of Ulster Unionism, was more problematic. The Fermanagh-based newspaper, The Impartial Reporter, for example, dismissively referred to Cavan as, quote, not in the ancient Ulster, it was in Connacht. The key reason for this discrepancy between Ulster as a geographic unit and Ulster as a cultural symbol is the association of cultural Ulster with Protestantism. In this context, Cavan and Monaghan's markedly larger Catholic populations and their contested Ulster status make sense, as does the relative readiness of the leaders of Ulster Unionists to countenance a partition settlement that excluded them. The complications of Cavan's claim to a place in Ulster were recognised by many six-county loyalists. Fermanagh loyalists were particularly preoccupied with characterising the limits of the Ulster character due to their own sense of precarity over their future position in Northern Ireland. Trimble, when discussing the electoral map of Fermanagh, claimed that South Fermanagh would have returned a Unionist MP in all elections were it not for the western areas of the county bordering Cavan and Leitrim. These areas were unnatural as they, quote, formerly belonged to the province of Connacht. Similarly, the border town of Rosslea, which had an active IRA unit, was declared to belong more to Monaghan than Fermanagh. However, Cavan Unionists themselves were very aggressive in their assertion of their Ulsterness. In a private letter to Hugh de Fellenberg Montgomery following partition, Lord Farnham sadly noted that we in Cavan were prouder of being Ulstermen than anyone in the whole province. And we can see in the table here the striking discrepancy between Cavan, the most southerly and most Catholic Ulster county, and its neighbours, which are even more markedly Catholic, and Cavan did sit distinct in that regard from Southern Ireland as well. Cavan loyalists participated enthusiastically in the Ulster campaigns of the early 1910s. In Cavan as elsewhere, the Ulster Covenant was signed up by a great number of Unionists on Ulster Day on the 28th of September 1912. The Covenant itself was an oath binding its signatories to resist partition in whatever way they could. In Cavan, the RIC County Inspector noted that there were ranges of depth to the signatory of the Covenant. Some saw the Covenant as a commitment to militarily resist, whereas others signed it more as a statement of political preference than as a commitment to that resistance. The Covenant would play a significant role in Cavan loyalist rhetoric for the coming decade. However, this does not necessarily imply it was taken up more strongly in that county than elsewhere. The late David Fitzpatrick has tabulated the contribution of Cavan to the Ulster Covenant and its female equivalent, the Women's Declaration. He calculated that around 71% of eligible Cavan men and 65% of Cavan women signed these documents. These figures are among the lowest in the province, only underperformed by men in Antrim and women in Belfast. These areas, however, had far larger Protestant populations to begin with and saw far higher turnout than Cavan did. This does not appear to have been a consequence either of Cavan's peripherality, as Monaghan was among the most subscribed counties to the Covenant. If Cavan loyalists failed then to demonstrate their commitment to the Union through the Covenant, they did find other areas where they were able to outperform their neighbours. In particular, the county experienced a surge, an upswing in interest in the Ulster clubs at the time of the Home Rule crisis. In November 1912, Cavan had 12 Unionist clubs in the county with 1,425 members, 23% of the eligible population. For comparison, Monaghan's membership in November 1912 was 1,313 or 20%. For both counties, these numbers are comparable with Antrim and Down and were far ahead of Fermanagh. Membership of the UVF in Cavan, and to a lesser extent Monaghan, was also particularly strong when compared to the rest of the province. 56% of the adult male Protestants in Cavan were recorded as being a member of the UVF in 1914, compared with 34% in Monaghan. In the strongly Protestant Ulster areas of Antrim, Down and Belfast Borough, this number was only 25%. Indeed, Cavan's rate of membership was higher than anywhere else in Ulster. In spite of Monaghan's larger Protestant population, the Cavan UVF boasted a membership of 3,451, while Monaghan could only muster 2,188. They also fared better in the number of arms held for the UVF. In November 1913, the Monaghan UVF's 1,650 members had to share 385 arms between them, roughly one gun for every 4 volunteers. Cavan, meanwhile, held 1,691 weapons between 3,041 men. By March 1914, this number had grown to 2,676 weapons, including a quarter of all the Martini Enfield rifles held in Ulster. Overall, it held roughly 10% of all arms in Ulster in the period just before the Larne gun running, in a county with just 2% of all Protestants. Monaghan in the same period had only increased its cash to 561, a fifth of what was held by Cavan. It is worth noting, however, that such high levels of arms did not translate into more significant violence in the War of Independence, and Cavan's revolution, for example, was much quieter than that of Monaghan. Despite this apparent great commitment, Cavan's more isolated Protestant population than Monaghan's was reflected in how their commitment to the Ulster Volunteers was framed in very different terms than elsewhere. Aware of their isolated position and fearful of the hostility that could be engendered by the actions of more bellicose Belfast volunteers, Colonel Oliver Nugent, the commanding officer of the UVF in Cavan, attempted to rename the organisation the Cavan Volunteer Force in 1913 and played down any military associations. Great War recruiting then was another area in which Ulster loyalists had distinguished themselves elsewhere in the build-up to partition. The rate of recruitment in Ulster roughly matched that in Britain and was far ahead of recruitment in any other Irish province. And Cavan was a significant contributor to this at first. Between the 15th of December 1914 and the 15th of December 1915, the county had an extremely high ratio of Protestant recruits to Protestant males with non-agricultural occupations. So that would be kind of what we would take as the cohort of possible recruits, as males with non-agricultural occupations. And if we look at that Protestant cohort, we find that 105 in every 1,000 were recruiting, which was the second highest ratio in Ulster, only behind Antrim, Belfast with 110 per 1,000. And then nationally, it tied with Longford and fell just short of the highest contributing county with Carlow, but both of these again had substantially smaller Protestant populations. And again, I'm indebted to the late David Fitzpatrick for these figures and for letting me share them. So Cavan is performing very, very well as in regards to Great War recruiting, especially at the start. However, this enthusiasm soon waned. The county inspector for Cavan noted that in 1916 the county saw almost no recruits, Catholic or Protestant, after Easter. At the same time, the Cavan Recruiting Committee saw significant division between its nationalist members who opposed the introduction of conscription and the Unionists who supported it. In a meeting of the committee in December 1915, Unionist William Wilson of Belturbet declared, "The time for recruiting is past. The government should now take the men they require and bring the war to a speedy and lasting resolution." This is not a Cavan-specific phenomenon, as all across Ulster recruiting committees struggled with the task of enticing more recruits without resorting to compulsion. Indeed, this lack of enthusiasm was best summarised by the nationalist chair of Monaghan County Council, Thomas Toll, who declared, quote, "The Protestant and Orange farmers in this part of the country were just as much opposed to this as the nationalists were. They had done their part in cropping the land, and they prepared now to sacrifice all that to go out to Flanders and lose their lives." Geoffrey Coulter, the Protestant deputy editor of An Phoblacht, also capitalised on this reluctance by founding the Protestant Anti-Conscription Society, which focused on Dublin and the border counties as a means of radicalising Protestants towards nationalism. Even though the Great War itself did not see a significant level of enthusiasm among the Protestant community in Cavan, it still formed an important part of its self-image. Loyalist papers such as the Northern Standard, which was based in Monaghan but served loyalists in both counties, thrilled at the exploits of local men abroad and printed tales of the heroism and sacrifice of those killed, often with an accompanying biography. The Cavan loyalist paper, the Irish Post and Weekly Telegraph, took the bold step of abandoning advertisements on its front page and instead ran with various photographs of the war. Additionally, both papers carried frequent reports of pro-war recruiting events, generally entirely Protestant and held in Protestant halls. So, as we've seen then, the issue of conscription became a way of distinguishing the Protestant community from their Catholic neighbours. Northern Standard editorials called for the inclusion of Ireland, or at least Ulster, in the conscription scheme. The District Orange Lodges of Cavan passed resolutions in their own support for a county-wide introduction of conscription, and Oliver Nugent, the commander of the Cavan Volunteer Force, described conscription as representing, quote, "moral regeneration." However, while the Unionist leadership may have taken a clear line on conscription, in reality the Loyalist community was divided on the issue. When canvassing in East Cavan in 1914, future TD Kevin O'Sheil was surprised to see how much support their anti-conscription speeches were given by, quote, "typical young Protestant farmers." At a mass protest against conscription in April 1918 in Cavan Town, it was noted that many Unionists had attended and how many Unionist shopkeepers had closed their stores for the day to enable more people to attend. As time went on and the cost of the war became more and more apparent, it seemed more and more Cavan loyalists were willing to break ranks with their leadership to oppose the implementation of conscription. Despite this complicated reaction with the war, Cavan loyalists were much more strongly in support of the conflict than their Catholic neighbours, and this simple distinction, even if it wasn't a universal one, served to draw clear lines between the two communities. The Northern Standard noted that the announcement of the armistice in 1918 was greeted by exclusively Protestant cheers in towns across Ulster. Elizabeth Adams remembered in her 1924 application for compensation that going to ring the bells of the local Anglican church in order to celebrate peace marked her out in the community as, quote, Protestant and loyalist. In Cavan, the celebrations were strongly coded as Protestant. Fireworks were let off near Lord Farnham's estate, and a special service was held in Kilmore Anglican Cathedral and a sports day organised outside Cavan Town, with the local rector, William Askins, handing out the prizes. In Ballyconnell, revellers marched from the Anglican parochial hall to the rectory, while in Red Hills a band holding Union flags formed at the Protestant hall and paraded through the village. However, Cavan loyalists understood the precarity of their position. In the case of a partition settlement that broke the integrity of Ulster, Cavan and Monaghan were the two most likely casualties. It's difficult to determine how likely partition was thought to be by Cavan and Monaghan Protestants before 1916. The concept of partition as a solution to Home Rule underwent a number of redefinitions before coming to the form that established the division of the 6 and 26 county states. So Terry Dooley then has correctly highlighted that the first time 3 county loyalists really had to engage with their potential abandonment was in March 1914, when Asquith, the Prime Minister, took public his proposals for Ulster exclusion. Asquith had settled on a solution in which Ulster would be excluded from a Home Rule settlement for 6 years, and in which any Ulster county could vote themselves out of Home Rule. Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal, with their significant Catholic majorities, would have been effectively abandoned under this policy, with the future of Tyrone and Fermanagh more ambiguous. Frederick Crawford, the Ulster Unionist who would later gain notoriety as the driving force behind the Larne gun running, wrote to Carson from Hamburg and noted that such a proposal would, quote, place the Protestants of Cavan, Donegal, Fermanagh and Monaghan in a position to say we deserted them. The proposal was denounced by the Northern Standard on the 4th of March 1914 as of such contemptuous merit to not deserve discussion, but it did establish the potential of an alternate six-county framework for Ulster. And we can see here in these two cartoons that I've put up kind of two opposing viewpoints or two opposing popular impressions of how partition would resolve. So in the first, in that quite famous cartoon, you see Carson essentially stealing the entirety of Ulster, and we can see that he settled for a 9-county settlement, which was understood to be what Carson was pushing for and was understood to be the Ulster Unionist goal. So if Ulster Unionist partition was to be undertaken, it would look something like that. And then on the opposite side, what we have is essentially a reaction to a suggestion by Churchill that only the Protestant majority states, so we can see here that even Fermanagh is being excluded, only those states be taken into the UK or be allowed to stay in the UK. And in this satirical suggestion here, you have a brand new canal separating Northern Ireland from Southern Ireland, with the land taken out of building that canal then used to join Northern Ireland to Scotland. So you can kind of see that there were these different ideas floating about as to what a partition would look like or what its default would be. And in this kind of uncertainty, the Ulster Covenant becomes an important symbol among Cavan loyalists. For them, it represented a commitment among and between all Ulster Unionists to negotiate only for a 9-county settlement. This was all placed on hold at the outbreak of war in 1914, but in 1916, Asquith had asked Lloyd George to take up Ireland, in his words. Lloyd George wished to push down the path of least resistance, with his inclination therefore being to exclude Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal from any potential northern state. He proposed that Home Rule would be granted to Southern Ireland, while a 6-county Ulster would continue to be administered directly from Westminster. Due to the ongoing war, and wishing to demonstrate their loyalty to the British Crown, 3-county delegates to the Ulster Unionist Council voted to accept this deal on the 12th of June 1916. Despite this acceptance, the plan soon fell apart when it emerged that Lloyd George had promised different concessions to Nationalists and Unionists, with Nationalists being told that this partition was temporary and Unionists that it was permanent. However, despite its quick collapse, at the time Cavan loyalists had accepted what they saw as a permanent sundering from their homeland. Unlike the partition of 1921, however, this was not seen as a betrayal by 6-county loyalists. Rather, it was a patriotic decision taken by 3-county loyalists for the benefit of Ulster. Later, this formed the basis for numerous attacks on 6-county partition. It was argued, reasonably in my view, that the wartime circumstances which drove that decision had passed. As the Northern Standard declared, it was on the same lines as the action taken in 1916 when the Unionists of the 3 counties listened to an appeal said to come from the government and reluctantly agreed to make a great sacrifice for the sake of empire, a sacrifice which they are afterwards assured would never again be asked from them. A pamphlet published in 1920 by representatives to the UUC from the 3 counties also framed the incident in heroic terms. At a time of great national emergency, the 3 counties had placed themselves, quote, in the hands of the other 6 counties, but never abandoned the covenant. The sacrifice itself was, quote, the greatest of lasting evidence of their devoted, unselfish loyalty to the King, Constitution and Empire. And even Edward Carson hailed their decision as the greatest piece of lasting evidence that he had ever seen. The greatest piece of lasting evidence for their devotion to King, Constitution and Empire that he had ever seen. This is, of course, an oversimplification on the part of all concerned. The 1916 delegates never consulted with their home constituents and instead reached this consensus amongst themselves based on a political deal which had already passed. Their official statement at the time offered no heroic stoicism, but rather protested against the government's proposals, especially while so many 3-county Covenanters were fighting a war for the same government. They did not accept this decision. They, quote, abided by it. It also ignored the attempts of Major Somerset Saunderson, one of the Cavan delegates, to have the decision revoked after he learned that Lloyd George's proposals had never even been before the Cabinet. The Church of Ireland Archbishop of Armagh, John Crozier, declared himself a Cavan Covenanter and protested to Carson that such a decision represented, quote, a flagrant breach of faith and honour. The failure of Lloyd George's scheme led to some celebration in Cavan and Monaghan. At a speech to the Cavan 12th in 1917, the head of the Cavan Orange Lodge, Travers Blackley, declared the covenant proven inviolable by events, and ironically advised Cavan Protestants to prepare themselves for frontier duty. The Irish Post published a series by Herbert Moore Pym on different covenants throughout history, casting them in a heroic light and ending on the refrain, "We know what we mean, and we mean what we say." Even as the three county delegates resigned from the UUC, they agreed to call for a special meeting to try and reverse the decision and try and, quote, save a split never to be healed. The petition they submitted to do so was signed by 100 members of the council and a representation from every county in Ulster. It cited Rule 3 of the council's constitution to force a special meeting of the council on the 27th of May to reconsider the issue. The statement requesting this meeting called on their six county brethren to not abandon them. Quote, "The Ulster people have stood together for many generations, and that confidence and reliance in each other has been the chief cause of their success and prosperity." Official protests by Lord Farnham and Colonel Saunderson cited the covenant as a binding agreement that had been betrayed. A pamphlet sent by three county Protestants to the Ulster Unionist Council opened with the text of the covenant, as we see here, but capitalised the word 9 so that it read, "The solemn league and covenant entered into between the Unionists of the 9 counties of Ulster." If you look through that text again, you can also see other elements highlighted. "Men of Ulster do hereby pledge ourselves in solemn covenant and to stand by one another," with that last one I think being particularly powerful. A meeting of the County Cavan Unionist Association passed a motion protesting, quote, most emphatically against the breach of the covenant caused by the Ulster Council in deserting their fellow covenanters. Similar motions were passed in Donegal and Monaghan and then collectively at a meeting in Clones in March 1920. And the vulnerability of the UUC to these arguments can be seen throughout the news and the use their enemies made of them. So the Irish Parliamentary Party MP T.P. O'Connor teased James Craig in the House of Commons on the 29th of March 1920, saying that they'd left the Covenanters of Donegal, Cavan and Monaghan to the Papists and the Nationalists. The three county delegates devoted significant time and money into promoting these arguments in the lead up to the meeting of the 27th of May. Numerous pamphlets were produced arguing that the same demographic and political facts were true of Ulster now as had been true in 1911 when the covenant was signed in 1912. To abandon that commitment in the face of so little change made a mockery of the word of Ulster Unionism. The decision of the UUC was rushed. Delegates had had little time to consult with their constituencies. They were ill-informed. It had been incorrectly stated in the meeting, notably by Thomas Moles, MP for Belfast Ormeau, that Sinn Féin would hold a majority across the 9 counties. Particular ire was reserved for the 6 county delegates, who, as Cavan loyalists saw it, had broken their oath and were now attempting to reframe the covenant as a temporary commitment. The 3 county press criticised the dishonesty of the 6 county delegates. It's clearly obvious that to obtain the full measure of selfish safety for themselves, they were prepared to jeopardise the safety of their southern friends. Lord Farnham had been so incensed by the acceptance of partition that he even rebuked the initial attempts by 3 county delegates to overturn the decision, stating angrily that he was done with them for all time. In a speech to the House of Lords on the 1st of December 1920, the Earl of Clanwilliam noted that 6 county loyalists had earned the hostility and perhaps the hatred of those who live in the 3 counties, for reasons which were more selfish than anything else, while James Strong of Tynan Abbey said, "The impression is left that the 3 counties have been thrown to the wolves with very little compunction." The impracticality of the proposed Northern Ireland is also criticised. It was alleged that it had an unmanageably complex border, it was pointlessly politically homogeneous, and, quote, "it would appear unwise that the Northern Parliament should have too great a Unionist majority, just as it is to be deplored that the Southern Parliament should have, and will have, too great a Unionist or a Nationalist majority." The key argument was to dismiss the idea that the 3 counties should be excluded because of their Nationalist majority. We have a majority, that is true, but so does Derry City, Fermanagh County, Tyrone County, South Armagh, South Down, and the Falls division of Belfast. Yet no one proposes to exclude them. The truth is that it is impossible to fix upon any exclusively Unionist area. There are more Unionists in the southern area than there are Nationalists in the 3 counties, and no provision whatever is made for them. In their case, we are told minorities must suffer, but that doctrine seems to be ignored when the minority is a nationalist one. Unfortunately for 3 county loyalists, the UUC once again affirmed its commitment to a 6 county state, while three county loyalists were assured that the decision had only been taken after much heart searching. Presumably this was of little solace. However, for all of this opposition, three county loyalists found themselves trying to turn back the tide. On the 23rd of December 1920, the Government of Ireland Act became law, partitioning Ireland into North and South. On 24th of May 1921, the first elections were held in the new Northern Territory, and in June of the same year, the Northern Irish Parliament sat for the first time. From the perspective of the loyalists of Cavan and Monaghan, the same traitorous delegates who had voted for partition were now running the new state. So, what now? Where do they go from here? Well, despite the energy with which Cavan loyalists had devoted themselves to their cause, once they had lost their community, in common with Southern loyalists elsewhere, they came to adapt to their new reality surprisingly quickly. For some, this manifested as a willingness to cooperate with the Free State once it was established. Others invested hope in the Boundary Commission to rescue them from Southern domination. Judge Samuel Brown, KC, opened the Clonus Quarter Sessions of February 1923 with a pledge of allegiance to the new Irish government. Indeed, so rapidly did resistance break down that by 1922 the Northern Standard was referring to its audience as ex-Unionists and urging them to take an active role. We will play an important part in deciding the contest in this country. The fate of Ireland is in the balance. We are concerned solely and absolutely for the fate of the plain people. The ex-Unionist voters must therefore decide which candidates are more likely to bring peace and prosperity. Traditional cross-Ulster events, such as the 12th, moved towards a three-county basis, with the 12th of 1920 and the Clonus 12th of 1921 organised on a three-county basis. In November 1921, the Cavan, Donegal and Monaghan Loyalist Association was established to safeguard the interests of the 70,000 loyalists in the three counties. At the combined Cavan-Monaghan 12th, held in Drum in 1920, Thomas Clevance of Rathkenny offered a resigned vision of their place in Ireland. He assured the audience that, "For ourselves and our property, I honestly think there is no special danger," before contenting himself to note that the worst-case scenario would not come to pass. Sinn Féin were not communists. He urged the Protestant community to commit themselves to the new Irish Free State and above all to the protection of Protestant schools in the counties, as he feared these would be the real victims of any regime change. This adaptation was echoed by the Northern Standard, who noted the passing of the new Government of Ireland Bill through Parliament with a jaded eye, but also commented on the attitude required of three-county Unionists. "We must look at the bill from the point of view of the Southern Unionists and the Irish Unionist Alliance, instead of from the old, or correct, Ulster standpoint." As Farnham noted, the mass resignation of three-county delegates to the UUC, "How can we remain members of a body that have plainly told us they don't want us, and that we are an encumbrance to them?" By July 1921, this position was even more advanced, with the paper now viewing the 6 counties as a wholly distinct entity and speaking on behalf of Unionists of the 26 counties and Southern Unionists. The Northern Standard accepted that this group, quote, "did not belong to the 6 counties and would have to continue their own course." This new Southern perspective was facilitated by the growing discontent with the traitors who now led Northern Ireland. In a speech to a combined Cavan-Monaghan audience near Clonus, Michael Knight, Grand Master of the Monaghan Orange Lodge, declared the 6 county Unionists had accomplished their desire. Quote, "They had sat tight in order to make for themselves positions of trust and emolument." When this is published in the Northern Standard, so this is something that doesn't come across as well in a lecture, when this was published in the Northern Standard, the word Unionist had quotation marks around it. We don't know if these quotation marks were added by the editor of the Northern Standard or contextually implied, or both. But they definitely tell us something either about Knight's attitude or the Northern Standard's attitude. The claims of the UUC that a 9-county Ulster state could not guarantee a Unionist majority as before were disparaged. The comfortable Unionist majority obtained in the first Northern Irish election seemed to confirm in the eyes of 3-county loyalists that this argument had simply been a pretence by those in the north to shore up their own position. By May 1921, the Standard was of the opinion that the true issue with the Government of Ireland Act was partition itself and not the establishment of a home government. If the 6 counties were to be induced or forced to give up the idea of a separate parliament and agree to a central assembly in Dublin, we would probably have a peace. In April of the same year, the paper complained about the expense of setting up 2 such parliaments and advised the cost should be reduced to 1 parliament established in Dublin. while Ian Dalton has described the manner in which Southern Protestants kept their heads down and largely associated amongst themselves following partition as a, quote, parallel state, this was not exactly the case in Cavan and Monaghan with their larger and more assertive communities. Michael Knight demonstrated his own comfortable adjustment to the Free State by being elected in 1936 as president of the Incorporated Law Society. While Cavan Protestants had lacked a presence in local councils since the early 1900s, they took lessons from their colleagues in Monaghan, where Protestants, also referred to as ex-Unionists by Thomas Toll, chair of the county council, such as Colonel James Madden and William Martin, remained active in local government. Those Protestants who still held office in either county saw themselves as representatives of the three-county Protestant community at large and aimed to put forward the perspective where they would. In 1935, for example, Colonel Madden tried to put forward a motion congratulating the King and Queen on their Silver Jubilee. When Thomas Toll refused to let the motion go forward, Madden's proposal was justified by Ireland's status as a dominion. Even over a decade after its establishment, the Free State still meant different things to Protestants and Catholics. Cavan also took its lead from Monaghan when it came to political organising. When Knight and other Monaghan Protestants founded the Monaghan Protestant Association, originally the Monaghan Protestant Defence Association, Cavan soon followed with the Cavan Progressive Association, which aimed to select and support Protestant candidates for local and general elections in the new state. In 1926, the Protestant Parliamentary Committee for County Cavan was also established for the same purpose. Sandra Carolan has calculated the initial membership to be roughly 50 people, of whom many were also members of the Orange Order, including William Vaughan and the Reverend William McAllister. Importantly, this was not a political party. It aimed to promote Protestant interests without making them an explicit force in Irish politics. However, while both communities would succeed in returning Protestant candidates to the Dáil in the early decades of the Free State, it was actually Cavan who did so first. John James Cole was elected as a TD 5 times in 1923, 27, 37, 38 and 43. Monaghan would follow by electing Alexander Hazlitt in 1927 and 1933, and Donegal Protestants would elect James Sproul Miles in every election between 1923 and 1943. Like Hazlitt in Monaghan and Sproul Miles in Donegal, Cole was able to capitalise on the increasing fragmentation of the nationalist vote and the single transferable voting system to pose a consistent electoral threat in the first 30 years of the Irish state. He was able to unite the Protestant vote behind him, and his successful career as a TD is striking for a number of reasons outside of this, but primarily it's because of how it was achieved with little to no attempt to marginalise or downplay his Ulster Protestantism. Cole was Grand Master of the County Orange Lodge for 2 decades before being succeeded by his son. He explicitly referred to himself as a representative of, quote, ex-Unionists, or if you wish to be more precise, you called them Protestants. However, despite this proud cultural unionism, Cole made little attempt to resurrect unionist politics in the Dáil, nor did Hazlitt or Miles Sproul. Cole spent the majority of his time as a TD avoiding any engagement in party politics, apart from promoting conciliation between Cosgrave and De Valera in the name of peace. Kurt Bowen has characterised the Protestant TDs from the 3 counties as being primarily contact men for their constituents in political and administrative circles. In campaigning, he focused primarily on agricultural issues and the improvement of local infrastructure, which contributed to his electoral success by making him friendly to transfers from farming interests. The closest Cole came to having a consistent unionist position was in his opposition to compulsory Irish in schools and his promotion of the free trade with Britain. Cole's performance in later elections was hurt not only by a decline in the Protestant population in Cavan, but by the strong Fianna Fáil establishment in the county, based on the TDs Patrick Smith and Michael Sheridan, both of whom held office for over 30 years. Smith in particular served a number of ministerial positions and holds the record for the longest period of time spent as a TD, with 53 years and 11 months. Fianna Fáil votes were consistently the least likely to transfer to Cole, and this is consistent in other counties as well. However, Cole consistently polled strongly. He was never eliminated or elected sufficiently early in an electoral tally for his own votes to be transferred. So ultimately then, this is the story of adaptation. Cavan loyalists recognised their perilous positions in the early 1900s and therefore bought wholeheartedly into the Ulster movement. When this did not work, they threw themselves just as strongly into trying to oppose the UUC. Finally, when they failed again, they committed themselves to working with the new Free State and being active, if reluctant, citizens. In this they succeeded, helped no doubt by the fact that the new Free State was nowhere near the sectarian entity that so much unionist rhetoric had claimed it would be. The story of Cavan Protestants demonstrates to us the ambiguities of the Ulster Unionist identity, how it was based on an unspoken idea of what was of Ulster and what was not. Cavan loyalists represented a challenge to this idea, belonging within geographical Ulster, while also being in a county that somewhat lacked the features that Ulster Unionists used to characterise the region: strong Protestant population, entrenched Presbyterianism, historical associations with Belfast. The way they bought into the movement, along with other three-county loyalists, only to be in turn rejected for it by political expediency, showed the degree to which the identity shifted according to the needs of the movement it served, or certainly this was how it appeared to Cavan loyalists. Additionally, this demonstrates how the Irish border, which now seems to have fallen along reasonably obvious, if contested, demographic lines, at the time was more of a consistently moving frontier zone. All in all, Cavan Protestants are an instructive community to examine precisely because of how they sat on the borderline between all of these different worlds, and, in negotiating them, highlighted their ambiguities.